Pip's parents are dead, and a mysterious man demands that he get him a file and whittles, threatening to cut out his heart and liver if he doesn't. Pip steals food to give to the man. On Christmas Eve, Pip is invited to play cards with Estella at Miss Havisham's house. Miss Havisham asks Pip if he's willing to work, and he says he is. Miss Havisham never pays him but treats him well. One day, Miss Havisham asks Joe Gargery to bring Pip's indentures so that he can become her apprentice. Joe agrees, and Miss Havisham pays Pip a premium for his apprenticeship. When Joe and Pip return home, Joe tells his sister how much Miss Havisham paid him. People in the crowd seem to think that Pip has done something wrong. Pip's apprenticeship at the forge starts off miserable, but he eventually gets used to it. Mr. Jaggers, a lawyer from London, offers Pip a handsome property and a chance to be raised as a gentleman. Pip is overjoyed, thinking Miss Havisham is going to make his fortune. Pip is taken in by Mr. Pocket, who provides him with a room at Barnard's Inn. He spends a lot of money, but still manages to stick to his books. Wemmick invites Pip to visit his house in Walworth. He introduces Pip to his father, the aged, who is a cheerful and well-cared-for old man. Pip is invited to dinner with his guardian and his friends. After dinner, he apologizes to Mr. Jaggers for the behavior of the other guests. One day, Estella writes to Pip saying she'll be living with a lady in Richmond who can introduce her to people. She also tells him that some people at Miss Havisham's house are against him and watch him. Pip plans to move in with Joe and get a job as a teacher in the new school being built in the area. On his 21st birthday, Pip receives a banknote from a mysterious benefactor. Mr. Jaggers says he cannot tell him anything about the person who gave him the note. Pip pays half of his £500 to a merchant to help Herbert financially. Herbert has no idea that Pip is behind the whole thing. Estella often speaks to Pip in a tone that suggests their association is forced upon them. At a ball, Pip points out Drumley, who is watching them from a corner, telling Estella that he is generally despised and has nothing to recommend him. Estella replies that she can bear it and that she doesn't care what others say about her. A man arrives at Pip's chambers, claiming to have saved money for him. Pip realizes he has been deceived by Miss Havisham, Estella, and the people of Satis House. Magwitch, the man from New South Wales, arrives at Pip's chambers. He tells Pip he has all the money he needs and will stay in England. Provis tells Pip his life story, explaining that he was a hardened criminal who met Compeyson, a smooth talker who hired him as his partner in crime. Provis was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment. Pip tells Miss Havisham that he has found out who his patron is, but that it is not a fortunate discovery. He also tells Estella that he loves her, but she remains unmoved, confirming that she is going to marry Drumley. Pip feels convinced that Miss Havisham is Estella's mother and that she is mentally ill. Pip saves Miss Havisham from a fire and the surgeon says she has serious injuries but they are not hopeless. Herbert tells Pip that Provis, Estella's father, had a child with a woman who swore to destroy the child and that he would never see it again. Magwitch is captured and brought to London for trial. Pip hires Mr. Jaggers to defend him. Magwitch is sentenced to death. Pip agrees to work for Herbert as a clerk. Many years later, Pip sees Joe and Biddy again, and they have a child named Pip. One evening, Pip secretly visits the site of the old house, where he sees Estella. She says she's kept the place as it was because it was the only determined resistance she made in her wretched years. Mr. Enfield tells Mr. Utterson about an incident he witnessed involving a man named Hyde who trampled over a girl's body and left her screaming on the ground. A crowd gathered around the girl and threatened to make a scandal if Hyde didn't pay them money. Hyde eventually agreed to pay £100 and took them to a door where he retrieved the money. Mr. Utterson becomes convinced that Hyde is a fiend after reading Dr. Jekyll's will, which stipulates that all of Dr. Jekyll's possessions would pass to Hyde in the event of his death or disappearance. Mr. Utterson begins to regularly patrol the street where the door is located, hoping to catch a glimpse of Hyde. One night, he sees Hyde walking down the street and approaches him. Utterson asks to see Hyde's face, and Hyde agrees. Utterson becomes convinced that there is something else about Hyde that he can't. A year later, London is shocked by the brutal murder of a high-ranking individual. The police suspect Mr. Hyde, a small man who was seen walking with the victim shortly before the murder. Mr. Utterson, who promised Dr. Jekyll he would look after Mr. Hyde, agrees to help the police find the murderer. Mr. Utterson inspects Mr. Hyde's rooms, which appear to have been ransacked. The police find a large sum of money in Mr. Hyde's bank account, further confirming their suspicions that he is the murderer. Dr. Jekyll emerges from seclusion and resumes his normal life, but becomes increasingly reclusive over the next few days. He writes to Utterson saying that he will be leading a life of seclusion from now on. A week later, Dr. Lanyon dies, and leaves a letter for Utterson that is to be opened only upon Utterson and Enfield see Dr. Jekyll sitting in his window one Sunday, but he quickly closes the curtains. Poole, the butler, visits Utterson and tells him that he is afraid of something happening at Dr. Jekyll's house. Utterson and Poole break into the cabinet in the back garden, where they find the body of Edward Hyde, who appears to have committed suicide by ingesting poison. Utterson concludes that they have arrived too late to save Dr. Jekyll. Utterson finds a will written by Dr. Jekyll naming him as the beneficiary in case of his death. Utterson is shocked by the contents of the will. He plans to return to the house later that night to call the police. Utterson receives a letter from Dr. Jekyll asking him to retrieve a drawer from his cabinet and give it to a man who will arrive at midnight. Utterson does so and is surprised to find a blood-red liquid and a book in the drawer. At midnight, a man arrives and introduces himself as Dr. Lanyon. Utterson is repulsed by the man's touch and suspicious of his intentions. The man drinks the contents of the glass and transforms into a hideous creature, revealing himself to be Edward Hyde, a wanted murderer. Dr. Jekyll explains that he had discovered a drug that could separate the good and evil in a person. He tested the drug on himself and was able to transform into Edward Hyde whenever he desired. However, he began to use his new powers to satisfy his desires, often returning from his excursions feeling ashamed of his actions. Dr. Jekyll reflects on his recent actions and decides to remain as Dr. Jekyll, vowing to live a life of strict morality. However, over time, he begins to feel the cravings of Edward Hyde once again, and eventually succumbs to temptation and commits a violent crime. Dr. Jekyll explains that he felt a sense of freedom and liberation while in his Edward Hyde form, and that he felt no remorse for his actions. He explains that his evil side, Edward Hyde, had grown stronger as his good side grew weaker. Dr. Jekyll explains that his supply of the drug had run out, and that he had searched London for more, but had been unable to find any. Jonathan arrives in Bistritz and is greeted by Count Dracula, who insists on carrying his luggage. Jonathan realizes he's a prisoner and resolves to watch the Count carefully. Lucy receives multiple marriage proposals but politely declines them as she already has feelings for Jonathan. Dr. Seward questions a patient named Renfield who he believes to be dangerous. A great storm hits Whitby and a Russian schooner crashes into the shore. The logbook reveals that the ship's captain had been acting strangely before setting sail. Mina wakes up to find Lucy trying to get out of the room multiple times during the night. Lucy's wounds on her neck have not healed and Mina fears they may become infected. Lucy recovers from her illness and is able to marry Arthur. Van Helsing takes over her care and prepares a blood transfusion for her. After the transfusion, Lucy seems to be recovering well. Lucy's mother is killed by a wolf that appears in the broken window of her room. Van Helsing manages to revive Lucy, but her mother is already dead. Dr. Hennessy writes to Dr. Seward about an incident involving Renfield, a patient who attacked two men. Jonathan sees the Count and follows his carriage. Several children go missing in the area and all of them have wounds on their throats. Dr. Van Helsing visits Mrs. Harker to ask about Lucy's sleepwalking habit. Dr. Seward receives a newspaper from Van Helsing with an article about children being attacked in Hampstead. Dr. Van Helsing explains that Lucy was bitten by a vampire and that is why she looks more beautiful now. He also explains that the vampire can only be killed by a sacred bullet or a wooden stake. Arthur volunteers to kill Lucy with a wooden stake, and successfully does so. The group agrees to help Van Helsing find the person responsible for all of this. Renfield requests to be released from the asylum, saying he is sane and deserves to be treated as someone under exceptional circumstances. However, Dr. Seward decides to wait for a while as he knows Renfield is prone to sudden changes in behavior. The group prepares to enter the Count's house to confront him. Mrs. Harker tells them what happened. The Count held her against his chest and bared her throat, saying he would drink her blood. Mina insists that they all work together to fight the Count. The group decides to wait for the Count between sunrise and sunset when he will be powerless. Mrs. Harker explains that the Count is a habitual criminal who confines himself to one purpose: to be safe and careless of all else. The group makes good progress throughout the day and night, and by morning they reach the Borgo Pass. Mina becomes excited as she recognizes the road that Jonathan traveled before. Dr. Van Helsing sees a group of men carrying a chest, and knows that the thing inside will be free at sunset. He draws a circle around Mina to protect her from the thing. As the sun sets, Jonathan attacks the chest with his knife, and the Count crumbles into dust. 7 years later, the group of men are happily married. They have kept the events of the past a secret, and have no proof to show anyone. Marlowe is a seaman who has just returned to London after spending several years in the Indian Ocean, Pacific, and China Seas. He has a passion for maps and decides he wants to work on a steamboat on a mighty river in a faraway land. Marlowe is hired by a company to work on a river steamboat in a certain area. He is examined by a doctor who asks if there has ever been any madness in his family. The doctor has a theory he would like to test on those who go to that area. Marlowe boards a French steamer and watches the coast as it slips by the ship. The trip seems long and idleness makes him feel isolated among the other men on the ship. Occasionally, a boat from the shore passes by, and Marlowe is comforted by the sight of the black men paddling it. Marlowe arrives at the company's station, which is made up of 3 wooden structures on a rocky slope. He sees workers who have been brought from all over the coast to work in the mines, and are now sick and exhausted. Marlowe spends several months repairing his boat after it is lost in the river. The manager, a common trader, explains that he cannot wait to start without Marlowe because the upriver stations need to be relieved. He pays no attention to Marlowe's explanations. The agent attempts to pump Marlowe for information about his acquaintances in Europe. He shows Marlowe a painting that Kurtz had done while waiting for means to go to his trading post. He explains that Kurtz is the chief of the inner station, and an emissary of science and progress. Marlowe explains that he let Kurtz talk about whatever he wanted and that he wanted the rivets to fix the boat because it was in a state of disrepair. The El Dorado expedition arrives at the station, and Marlowe overhears the manager's nephew explain that Kurtz had sent a fleet of canoes down the river with an English half-caste clerk to transport the ivory. Kurtz had intended to return himself, but changed his mind and left the half-caste to continue down the river alone. Marlowe travels up the river in his steamboat, and sees a burst of yells, a whirl of black limbs, and a mass of bodies swaying under the heavy foliage. The prehistoric man curses them, prays to them, or welcomes them, but they are too far away to understand. The worst part of the experience is the suspicion that the natives aren't inhuman. The boat continues along the river, and Marlowe loses sight of the object of his focus. The manager advises that they wait until morning to continue on, as the navigation is too dangerous at night. The crew had been given 3 pieces of brass wire each week to buy food in the villages, but there were either no villages or the people were hostile, so the crew had no way to use the wire. Suddenly, the crew members lay down on the deck, and Marlowe realizes they are being shot at. The pilgrims open fire on the bush with their Winchesters. A man is wounded and dies without uttering a sound. Marlowe reflects on how he had been looking forward to talking with Kurtz, but realizes he will never hear Kurtz speak after all. Marlowe reflects on Kurtz's life and how he had been consumed by the wilderness. He explains that Kurtz had a lot of ivory and enjoyed it as long as he could see. The pilgrims and the manager gather around the pilot house and talk about Kurtz and the station. A Russian man appears on the shore and assures them that it's safe. He introduces himself as a Russian who ran away from school and served in English ships. The Russian explains that Kurtz had wanted an audience and talked to him about love. He says that Kurtz had been under a lot of stress and had not dared to take down the severed heads on stakes. Marlowe is shocked by the sight of the severed heads, and the Russian explains that Kurtz had been under a lot of stress. The Russian explains that he had been trying to keep Kurtz alive, and that Kurtz had been abandoned for months without food or medicine. The manager explains that Kurtz has done more harm than good to the company and that the district is closed to them for a while. The Russian tells Marlowe that Kurtz ordered the attack on the steamer, thinking it would scare them away. Marlowe is determined to find Kurtz and give him a beating. He eventually finds Kurtz, who is unsteady on his feet. Kurtz tells him he is waiting for death. The manager's boy comes in and says that Kurtz is dead. All the pilgrims rush out to see. Marlowe says he was considered callous for not eating much at dinner. He says he did not go near Kurtz's body and that the next day, the pilgrims buried something in a muddy hole. A man claiming to be Kurtz's cousin comes to Marlowe and says that Kurtz should have been a politician. A woman comes to Marlowe, saying she had been mourning for more than a year since Kurtz's death. She says she believed in Kurtz more than anyone else on earth. Marlowe tells her that Kurtz's last words were her name, and she cries out in triumph. Nobody moves for a while. Huck's father is found dead in the river, but Huck doesn't believe it's really him. He thinks it's a woman dressed in men's clothes. Huck decides to run away from the widow's house and live off the land with his father. Huck meets Jim, Miss Watson's slave, who has been on the island for 3 days surviving on berries. Huck and Jim decide to sell their raft and take a steamboat up the Ohio River to get away from the troubles they're facing. However, the raft gets carried away by the strong current and Huck loses sight of it. Huck is taken in by the Grangerfords, a well-mannered family who treat him kindly. He forgets his real name in the process. One day, Huck and Buck go hunting and encounter Harney Shepherdson. Buck shoots at him due to a feud between their families. The Grangerfords and Shepherdsons have been feuding for 30 years, with many killings and injuries. Huck and Jim set off on a raft to escape the violence. They encounter 2 men who claim to be the Duke of Bridgewater and the King of England. The 2 men perform a play in a town and make a lot of money. The narrator steals the bag of money from the 2 frauds and hides it in Peter Wilkes' coffin. The crowd rushes to the graveyard to dig up Peter's corpse to check the tattoo on his chest. They find a bag of gold on his chest. The king and duke arrive on a boat and ask the narrator what his plan was in running away. The narrator says he was scared of being hanged. The king admits to having intended to steal the money, but someone else stole it before him. The king and duke get drunk and talk privately, making Jim and Huck suspicious. Jim is captured by men who offer a reward for his return. Tom and Huck plan to free Jim by sawing off his bed leg and creating a rope ladder for him to escape with. They manage to free Jim successfully. After 3 weeks of hard work, the group manages to gather all the items needed for Jim's cell. Jim says that he remembers the house that floated down the river with a man inside, and that he went in and uncovered him. He says he can get his money whenever he wants it. Huck decides to head to the territory ahead of the rest, as Aunt Sally is going to adopt him and civilize him, which he doesn't want.
Jane is punished by Mrs. Reed and locked in the Red Room after John Reed hits her. Mr. Lloyd, an apothecary, tends to her and suggests she go to school. Jane is enrolled at Lowood Institution, a charity school for orphans. Mr. Brocklehurst, who oversees the school, makes Jane stand on a stool for half an hour and forbids anyone from speaking to her after accusing her of being a liar and an agent of the devil. Jane becomes close to Miss Temple, who becomes a motherly figure to her. After Miss Temple marries and moves away, Jane applies for a job as a governess in the household of Mrs. Fairfax. Jane arrives at the mansion owned by Mr. Rochester, where she meets Adela, a little girl who speaks fluent French. Jane is hired as a governess to Adele, Mr. Rochester's daughter. Jane admires the beauty of the house and its inhabitants, especially Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester explains that Adele is the daughter of a French opera dancer named Céline Varens, with whom he once had a passionate affair. He took in Adele and raised her. One day, Jane saves Mr. Rochester's life when his room catches fire. Jane begins to fall in love with Mr. Rochester, but knows he intends to marry Miss Ingram for her connections and status. Jane believes that Miss Ingram could easily win his heart if she behaved more genuinely around him. At the party, an old woman claims to be a sorceress and tells Jane that her future depends on her taking an opportunity that has been laid out for her. She then informs Jane that Mr. Rochester is to be married to Miss Ingram soon. Jane realizes that the old woman who appeared at the party was actually Mr. Rochester in disguise. After Mrs. Reed dies, Jane learns that John left his fortune to her. Jane stays at Thornfield for another week after Mrs. Reed's death, during which time she falls in love with Mr. Rochester. Before the wedding ceremony begins, a solicitor reveals that Mr. Rochester has a wife who is still living. He explains that Mr. Rochester was previously married to his sister, Bertha Mason, in Jamaica 15 years prior. Bertha is a lunatic who is kept under watch at Thornfield Hall. Jane and Mr. Rochester marry, but Jane continues to provoke him to maintain a distance between them. Jane's feelings for Mr. Rochester grow stronger, and she begins to view him as her entire world. Mr. Rochester explains that he was forced to marry Miss Mason in order to keep his estate together. He declares that he still intends to marry Jane in all but name, and that she will live in a villa in France. Jane agrees to leave, but before she does, she kisses Mr. Rochester's cheek and tells him she hopes he'll be kept safe. Jane leaves the house and wanders around the village, hoping to find work. She eventually meets Hannah and her two sisters, Diana and Mary, who offer her shelter. St. John, a Christian philosopher, agrees to help Jane find work as a teacher at a school he is establishing for poor girls. Jane becomes very popular in the community and is happy with her life as a teacher. However, she still experiences bouts of loneliness and sadness. St. John explains that he is not actually in love with Miss Oliver, but that he simply experiences physical attraction towards her. St. John informs Jane that she is now an heiress and that she can use her money to help her family and friends. Jane divides her inheritance equally among her cousins. St. John asks Jane to accompany him to India as his assistant, but she refuses to marry him. However, after Jane explains that she would be willing to marry him if she were convinced it was God's will, St. John is overjoyed. Jane and Rochester have a quiet wedding ceremony, and they are now very happy. Rochester eventually recovers his sight in one eye, and he is able to see his firstborn son. St. John leaves England to pursue his work in India, and remains unmarried.
Basil explains that he was inspired to create new art after seeing Dorian's fascinating personality. Dorian sits for Basil's painting, and Lord Henry joins him. Dorian becomes deeply affected by Lord Henry's words, wishing he could stay young forever. Dorian tells Lord Henry that he's in love with an actress named Sybil Vane. He explains that he first saw her perform in Romeo and Juliet and has been going to see her perform every night since. He plans to take her away from the hands of the old Jew who manages her career. Dorian tells Lord Henry that he's engaged to Sybil. Jim Vane, Sybil's brother, says he'll kill Dorian if he ever does Sybil wrong. At the theatre, the crowd is packed to watch Sybil's performance. However, her performance becomes more and more artificial as the play goes on. Neither of Dorian's friends are impressed by her acting. Dorian is disappointed by Sybil's lackluster performance and angrily tells her that he no longer loves her. Sybil leaves the theatre and is found dead in her dressing room having ingested poison. Lord Henry explains that Sybil killed herself because she loved Dorian. After a few years, Dorian grows tired of being away from England and gives up his villa in France and his house in Algeria, afraid that someone might discover his secret. On the eve of his 38th birthday, Basil tells Dorian that rumors are being spread about him in London, saying that he's responsible for the downfall of many young men. Dorian becomes enraged and stabs Basil to death. He realizes there's no evidence against him. The next morning, Dorian wakes up feeling slightly sick at the memory of what he'd done the previous night. He begins sketching human faces, noticing that every face he draws looks like Basil. Dorian asks Alan to help him dispose of a dead body in his house. Alan initially refuses, but Dorian reveals that the man was murdered, so Alan agrees to help him. At a party, Dorian is quiet and distracted. Lord Henry asks him what's wrong, and Lady Narborough believes he's in love. Dorian goes to a shabby house and talks to Adrian, a young man with smooth yellow hair. He's accosted by James Vane, Sybil's brother, who recognizes him and puts away his gun. A week later, Dorian stabs his portrait with a knife, and a dead man is found in the room with a knife in his heart. The servants recognize the dead man as their master, Dorian Gray. Ishmael joins a whaling voyage as a sailor because he wants to see the great whale himself. He arrives in New Bedford and stays at the Spouter Inn. There he meets Queequeg, a harpooner from New Zealand. The two become close friends and set sail on the Pequod, an old ship owned by Peleg and Bildad. Ishmael is aware that whalers do not get paid wages, but instead receive a share of the profits called a lay. Peleg and Bildad are impressed by Queequeg's skill with a harpoon and offer him a position on the ship. As Ishmael and Queequeg leave the Pequod, a stranger asks if they have seen Old Thunder yet. The ship is prepared for the voyage and Captain Ahab, a very intimidating man, finally joins the crew. Ahab declares that he will chase the white whale, Moby Dick, until he gets his vengeance. Rumors about the white whale spread among the whalemen, and many are terrified of him. However, there are still those willing to hunt the whale, including Ahab, who has already lost 3 boats in the pursuit of the whale. His crew consists of mongrel renegades who share his intense hatred for the whale. Ahab studies the charts of the sea to calculate the best day to hunt the whale's prey. He is confident in his calculations. Ahab believes he can predict where whales will be by studying the charts of previous voyages. He therefore plans to spend the next 3 years searching for the whale in various locations. The crew spots a school of whales and pursues them. The whale manages to escape after being grazed by Queequeg's harpoon. The storm grows more intense and the crew is forced to swim to safety. The crew experiences a sense of dread as they sail through calm seas. The captain sails to Tahiti to find more crew members. The crew spots a large white mass in the distance, which they believe to be the white whale. The whale is eventually killed and Stubbs scatters the dead ashes over the water. The crew begins to cut up the whale and attach a hook to it. The blubber of the whale is similar to beef but tougher and more elastic. The narrator explains the differences between the sperm whale and the right whale. He explains that the right whale's head is more inelegant than the sperm whale's. The crew spots a group of whales in the distance and they are confident they will be able to capture many of them as they sail through the straits. Suddenly, a group of pirates appear behind them, pursuing them. The crew manage to outrun the pirates and continue to pursue the whales. A whale becomes entangled in the harpoon line that it is towing, and it is violently flailing around, wounding and murdering its own comrades. The crew observes a school of whales consisting of a group of females and a single male. The male is very protective of his females and will attack any other male that attempts to get close to them. Stubbs suspects that the French ship has ambergris, a valuable commodity. He tricks the French captain into thinking the whale is not worth much, and then excavates the whale to find a large amount of ambergris. While processing the sperm, Ishmael becomes so immersed in the work that he begins to feel affection for his fellow crew members. Ahab spots a ship with English colors and asks if they've seen the white whale. The captain says he saw the white whale last season and that he took Ahab's arm and leg. Queequeg becomes ill with a fever, but rallies and declares himself fit for a fight. The crew finally emerge into the Great South Sea, and Ahab dreams of killing the white whale. Perth reveals that he lost his feet in a robbery that killed his family. He chose to go to sea in search of a new life. The Pequod sails further into the Japanese cruising ground, but with little success. Ahab decides to stop using the sun to guide his ship and instead use the ship's compass and dead reckoning. Ahab realizes that the ship's compasses have been affected by the storm. Ahab announces that whoever kills the whale will get a large sum of gold. The crew is filled with excitement as they pursue the whale. Ahab throws his harpoon at the whale and manages to hit it. The whale then heads towards the ship, and Ahab throws his last spear at it. The line gets caught around Ahab's neck. The narrator explains that he was the one who survived the shipwreck and took the place of Ahab's bowsman.
Count von Kram, the King of Bohemia, asks Holmes to retrieve compromising letters he wrote to Irene Adler 5 years ago. Irene plans to use the letters to ruin the king's upcoming marriage to the King of Scandinavia's daughter. Holmes follows Irene and learns that Godfrey Norton has the photograph containing the letters. Wilson, a pawnbroker's assistant, is hired by the League of the Red-Headed Men, but starts to feel the job is a fraud. Holmes deduces that Mr. Windybank, Mary Sutherland's stepfather, disguised himself as Hosmer Angel to court her. Charles McCarthy is found dead and his son James is arrested for murder. Holmes investigates and determines that an old man killed McCarthy because he didn't want his daughter entangled in the same problems he faced. James is acquitted at the assizes. John Openshaw tells Holmes that his uncle Elias and his father both received letters with dried orange pips in them, and died soon after. John himself is found dead in the river. Holmes investigates the disappearance of Mr. St. Clair and determines he was murdered. Helen Stoner, who is living with her stepfather Dr. Roylott, visits Holmes because she is afraid for her life. She explains that her twin sister Julia died under mysterious circumstances. That night, Holmes and Watson wait outside Roylott's house and find him dead with a snake wrapped around his head. Holmes deduced that the doctor had trained the snake to return to him when summoned. Victor Hatherley visits Holmes, explaining that he was injured by another person. He was approached by Colonel Stark, who offered him a job fixing a hydraulic press. Hatherley is almost killed by a hydraulic press, but is rescued by a woman. Holmes explains that the gang is counterfeiting half-crowns and the police have been trying to catch them. Lord Street Simon hires Holmes to investigate the disappearance of his wife, Lady Street Simon. Holmes believes that Flora Miller lured Lady Street Simon away. Alexander Holder agrees to loan a very famous and noble person £50,000, and the man leaves a valuable piece of jewelry as collateral. The jewels are later stolen. Holmes believes Sir George Burnwell stole the jewels and that Mary was his accomplice. Violet Hunter is offered a job as a governess for a spoiled child. She grows increasingly uneasy about her employer's behavior. Holmes believes that Alice Rucastle, who had gone to America, is imprisoned in the cellar.
Gregor wakes up to find himself transformed into a horrible vermin. He's a traveling salesman and hates his job. He wishes he could speak to his boss frankly about his feelings. His boss arrives to check on him personally. The chief clerk is astonished by Gregor's behavior and says his performance at work has been unsatisfactory lately. Gregor attempts to open the door to let the chief clerk see him. His mother cries out that he could be seriously ill and that they should get the doctor. Gregor tells his sister not to make things harder for him at the office. Gregor realizes that it's out of the question to let the chief clerk go away in that mood if his position in the firm is not to be put in danger. Gregor is able to walk on his own now, but his father is determined to get him back into his room as quickly as possible. Gregor is afraid his father will hit him with the stick if he takes too long. Gregor wakes up feeling rested and smells food by the door. His sister brings him food and water throughout the day. Gregor is glad to hear that there are still assets left from his father's business, as he had thought there was nothing left. Gregor becomes bored of lying on the floor and starts crawling up the walls and ceiling to entertain himself. His sister notices and makes it easier for him by removing the furniture that gets in his way. Gregor's mother hesitates at the door but his sister convinces her to come in. Gregor realizes he had wanted the furniture removed because he had been confused and wanted to forget his past. He realizes the furniture is good for him. Gregor's family is struggling to make ends meet and they begin to sell off their valuables to make ends meet. Gregor's mobility is severely limited after his father throws an apple at him in anger. His sister no longer thinks about how she can please him and instead hurriedly pushes food into his room before rushing out to work. His room becomes dirtier and dirtier as his sister refuses to clean it up. The three gentlemen who rent the room sometimes take their evening meal there. One evening, The gentlemen ask if the young lady would like to play the violin for them. Gregor's parents and sister are all preoccupied with the performance. Gregor wishes he could eat something too, but not what the gentlemen are eating. The middle gentleman points out Gregor to his father, who quickly tries to block the gentleman's view of Gregor. The gentlemen become annoyed and declare they are giving notice on their rooms. His sister declares that they have to get rid of Gregor. His father says that if Gregor could understand them, they might be able to come to some kind of arrangement, but as it is, it's got to go. Gregor slowly crawls back to his room and his sister quickly locks the door behind him. The cleaner comes in the next morning to find Gregor dead. Mr. Samsa tells the three gentlemen to leave his home immediately. The Samsa family decide to make use of the day by relaxing and going for a walk. Mr. Samsa says that the cleaner will get sacked that night, but neither his wife nor his daughter respond.
Jack comes to town to propose to Gwendolen, his first cousin. Algernon says he doesn't give his consent for Jack to marry Gwendolen because she's his first cousin. Jack says he has a brother named Earnest who gets into trouble, and that he adopted the name Earnest in town to adopt a high moral tone. Gwendolen says she's always been fascinated by Jack, even before she met him. She says she's always wanted to love someone named Earnest, and that the moment Algernon told her he had a friend named Earnest, she knew she was destined to love Jack. Jack asks Gwendolen to marry him, and she accepts. Lady Bracknell sees Jack on his knees proposing to Gwendolen and tells him to rise, as it's indecent. Gwendolen tells her she's engaged to Jack. Lady Bracknell says she's surprised. Lady Bracknell questions Jack about his age, income, and background. He says he was found in a handbag in Victoria Station and that Mr. Cardew adopted him. Lady Bracknell is shocked by this and thinks it shows a contempt for family life. Gwendolen tells Jack that her mother may never approve of their marriage, but that she still may marry someone else. She says she'll communicate with him daily. Miss Prism instructs Cecily to read her political economy book. Merriman informs Cecily that Jack's brother, Ernest, has arrived at the manor house. Cecily is excited to meet him. Algernon enters, pretending to be Ernest. Cecily realizes he's Algernon. She agrees to try to reform him. Jack informs Chasuble that his brother Ernest has died and that he wants to be baptized that afternoon. Algernon enters and tells Jack he's sorry for all the trouble he's caused him and that he intends to lead a better life in the future. He then professes his love for Cecily and tells her he wants to marry her. Cecily shows him letters he wrote to her professing his love, but he denies ever writing them. Gwendolen arrives and tells Cecily she's engaged to Ernest as well and that an announcement of their engagement will appear in the newspaper on Saturday. Cecily shows Gwendolen her diary proving she and Ernest are already engaged. Gwendolen says she'll consider it her duty to rescue Ernest if he's been entrapped into a foolish promise. Cecily and Gwendolen meet and declare they'll consider each other sisters. They both say they're engaged to Ernest, but Jack says he doesn't have a brother named Earnest. They realize they're not actually engaged to anyone. Lady Bracknell enters the room and declares that all communication between Jack and her daughter must cease immediately. She approves of the engagement between Algernon and Cecily, and says the marriage should take place soon. However, Jack refuses to give his consent for Cecily to marry Algernon because he suspects Algernon of being untruthful. Lady Bracknell says that Cecily will be of age soon, and that her guardian's consent isn't necessary. Jack says that if Lady Bracknell consents to his marriage with Gwendolen, he'll allow Algernon to marry Cecily. Lady Bracknell says she doesn't want Gwendolen to have the same fate she has planned for her. Miss Prism says she left the baby in a handbag in a London railway station 28 years ago. Jack asks her where she put the handbag, and when he returns, he asks if the bag he's holding is hers. She says it is, and that it's been a great inconvenience not having it for the past 28 years. Jack reveals that he's the baby she left in the handbag 28 years ago. Lady Bracknell reveals that Jack is actually the son of her sister, Mrs. Moncrief, and Algernon's elder brother. Everyone is overjoyed by the news. Jack learns that his name is actually Ernest, after all. Nora tells Helmer that this is the first year they don't need to economize for Christmas as Torvald will soon be earning more money. Helmer gives her some money to help with the housekeeping expenses. Mrs. Lind, a stranger, arrives at the house. Nora recognizes her as Christine, a woman she hasn't seen in 9 years. Christine explains that her husband died, leaving her with nothing. Nora promises to talk to Torvald about helping Christine find work. Nora reveals to Christine that she secretly saved up money to send Torvald to Italy to save his life. She never told Torvald because he would have been upset to know he owed her anything. She's been careful to save money from her housekeeping allowance to pay off the debt. Christine is shocked by Nora's secret. Krogstad, a morally corrupt man, asks Nora to use her influence to ensure he keeps his job at the bank. Nora explains that she owes Krogstad money, and he threatens to tell Torvald about her debt if she doesn't help him. Helmer returns home and Nora explains that she promised to help Krogstad because he threatened to tell Torvald about her debt. Helmer is upset that she agreed to help Krogstad, and explains that he's a dishonest man who lies to everyone around him. Nora asks Helmer to help her decide what to wear to the upcoming fancy dress ball. He agrees to do so. Nora tells Helmer she wants him to keep Krogstad on at the bank because they live a peaceful life and shouldn't have any worries. Helmer fires Krogstad anyway, saying he'll take responsibility for whatever happens. Dr. Rank arrives and tells Nora he's going to die soon due to spinal consumption caused by his father's excessive consumption of certain foods. Nora doesn't want him to die and says she doesn't want new ties with anyone else. Rank asks Nora if she'll let him do something for her, but she says she doesn't need any help at the moment. Nora explains that being with Torvald is a little like being with her father, and that she loves being around Rank as well. Nora takes out a loan from Krogstad, but forged the name on the documents. She tells Christine that if anything happens to her, Christine must be her witness that she did it alone. Mrs. Lind talks to Krogstad, and tells him that she wants to join forces with him. She says she wants to be a mother to his children, and that they need each other. Krogstad agrees to work with her. Helmer and Nora return from the dance, and Nora is wearing an Italian costume. Helmer says that everyone at the dance thought that Nora looked charming, but that she's also very self-willed. He then takes her away from the dance. Mrs. Lind tells Nora that she talked to Krogstad, and that Nora must tell Helmer about it. Nora refuses to do so. Helmer is happy to be alone with Nora again. He pretends to be secretly in love with her and imagines bringing her home as his bride. Suddenly, Rank enters the room and enjoys the wine and champagne. He says he'll be going as an invisible man at the next fancy dress ball. Helmer finds a letter in the letterbox with a black cross over Rank's name, indicating that he's going to shut himself away and die. However, a new letter arrives, saying that the sender regrets and repents. Helmer is relieved and tells Nora he's forgiven her. Nora says she wants to talk to Helmer about serious matters that she's never discussed with him before. She says she's never been truly happy in her marriage and that she's treated like a doll by both her father and Helmer. She decides to leave Helmer and go back to her old home to educate herself. Nora says she wanted to kill herself to prevent what happened from happening. Helmer says he would work hard for her, but wouldn't sacrifice his honor for her. Nora says she's realized she's been living with a strange man for the past 8 years and bore him 3 children. She says she's no longer fit to be his wife and that she can't spend the night in his room. She returns his ring to him and says she'll often think of him and the children but won't accept anything from him. Helmer asks if he can write to her or help her if she's in need, but she says no to both.
Alice falls down a deep well and lands in a heap of sticks and leaves. She follows the white rabbit down a long passage, but loses sight of it. She finds a bottle that says, "Drink me," on it and drinks it, shrinking to 10 inches tall. She grows to 9 feet tall and then shrinks again. She cries and grows larger again. A mouse appears and Alice asks it for help. The mouse agrees to tell Alice its story if she'll take it to the shore. Once there, the animals discuss how to get dry again. The dodo suggests a caucus race to get dry. Everyone crowds around Alice asking for prizes. Alice pulls out a box of comfits and hands them out as prizes. The mouse then asks Alice if she has a prize for herself, and she says she only has a thimble. The dodo takes the thimble and presents it to Alice, saying they all beg her acceptance. Alice grows larger after drinking a bottle she finds on a table. She stops growing before she gets too big. She then starts to miss being at home and wishes she hadn't gone down the rabbit hole. She hears the rabbit calling for her and realizes she's now much bigger than the rabbit, so she's no longer afraid of it. Alice decides her first priority is to grow back to her normal size, and her second priority is to find her way into the garden. She doesn't know how to do either of those things, however. She sees a caterpillar smoking a hookah on a mushroom and asks him how she can grow back to her normal size. The caterpillar tells her that one side of the mushroom will make her grow taller, and the other side will make her shorter. She starts eating the mushroom. Alice grows back to her normal size after eating the mushroom. She wonders how to get into the garden and comes across a little house. She sees two footmen, one of whom receives a letter from the other. The Duchess leaves to play croquet with the Queen, and Alice is left to nurse the baby. The baby turns into a pig and runs away into the woods. Alice approaches the March Hare and the Hatter having tea under a tree. The Hatter asks Alice if she can guess a riddle, and the Dormouse chimes in with a comment. The Hatter says that if Alice were to befriend Time, he'd do almost anything she liked with the clock. Alice attends a party with the Mad Hatter and the March Hare. The Dormouse tells a confusing story about three sisters who live at the bottom of a well and eat treacle. Alice becomes bored and leaves the party. She finds herself in a beautiful garden where 5 and 7 are painting the roses red. Suddenly, the Queen and her procession arrive. The Queen orders the execution of the gardeners for making a mistake with the roses. Alice saves them by putting them in a flower pot. The Queen asks Alice to play croquet, but the game quickly becomes chaotic. The Duchess explains that the moral of the game is that it's love that makes the world go round. The Queen orders the Duchess to choose between death or having her head cut off. The Duchess chooses death and disappears. The King pardons everyone. The Griffin tells Alice that no one is actually executed, and takes her to. The Mock Turtle tells Alice about the lessons they used to have in the sea, and how they used to throw lobsters into the sea and swim after them. The King and Queen of Hearts are seated on their throne, with a crowd of various birds and beasts gathered around them. The White Rabbit reads the accusation written on a parchment scroll. The Hatter is the first witness. He starts trembling as he explains that he can't remember what happened after he started drinking tea. The King tells him to leave if he has no more evidence. The next witness is the Duchess's cook, who refuses to give evidence. The White Rabbit reads Alice's name as the next witness, and she starts feeling curious to see what the next witness would be like. The King says the trial cannot proceed until all the jurors are back in their proper places. Rule 42 says that anyone over a mile high must leave the court, but Alice denies being that tall. The White Rabbit reads a set of verses written by the prisoner, which the King believes to be the most important piece of evidence heard so far. The King asks the Queen if she's ever had fits, and she says she hasn't. The Queen gets angry and tells everyone to sentence Alice to death. Alice wakes up to find her sister sitting next to her. Her sister thinks about Alice's adventures and starts dreaming about the strange creatures from Wonderland. Miss Manette receives a letter from the bank informing her that information about her father's small property has been discovered. She wants to travel to France to identify him and restore him to life. Mr. Lorry explains that her father has been found under another name and is being held in a house in Paris. In court, Mr. Darnay is accused of treason. However, he is acquitted after his patriot friend, Roger Clee, testifies against him. Mr. Lorry visits the doctor's house on a Sunday afternoon as he often does. Miss Pross, the housekeeper, worries that many people will come to the house to look for Ladybird. Suddenly, the doctor starts to feel ill and says they should go inside. Charles Darnay, the Marquis' nephew, returns to France to pursue the sacred object that took him away. He tells the Marquis that he renounces his French property as it is full of misery. Charles has been in love with Lucy Manette for a long time but has never told her about his feelings. Stryver tells Laurie that he intends to marry Lucy for pragmatic reasons. Defarge and his wife discuss the anger in the neighborhood regarding Gaspard's execution. They learn that Miss Manette is going to marry Charles Darnay. Defarge becomes visibly upset upon hearing this news. After the wedding, the couple returns home to breakfast. Mr. Lorry decides to watch the doctor closely, hoping this would help him recover. Mr. Lorry wakes up to find the doctor reading at the window, seemingly normal. Sidney Carton approaches Charles and asks to be friends with him. 3 years later, The people of St. Antoine celebrate the fall of the Bastille and capture of Foulon. Charles is imprisoned in La Force for being an emigrant. The doctor visits him regularly and brings messages from Charles to Lucy. Charles is summoned to the tribunal and is accused of being an emigrant whose life is forfeit to the Republic. The president declares Charles free, and the crowd erupts in cheers. However, 4 men in red caps enter the room and tell Charles that he is once again a prisoner of the Republic. Charles returns home and embraces his wife, but Lucy is still scared because the innocent are often put to death on mere suspicion and malice. Solomon unexpectedly appears in the wine shop and Miss Pross greets him with a hug. Sidney follows Barsad, a spy for the English government, to the wine shop and sits near him. He tells Barsad that he knows he is a traitor to the French government. Charles Evremond, called Darnay, is accused of being an enemy of the Republic. Manette writes a letter declaring that he is in his right mind and that he writes the truth. Carton tells Mr. Lorry to tell Lucy that she and her family are in danger and must leave Paris immediately. Miss Pross kills Madame Defarge in self-defense and runs away from the scene. The people of Paris say that the face of the man accused of being an enemy of the Republic is the most peaceful they have ever seen. The narrator, a Yale graduate, moves to New York to learn the Bond business. He visits his second cousin, Daisy, and her husband, Tom, for dinner. During the dinner, Daisy mentions she wants to go back to Chicago the next day. The narrator recalls the first time he met Tom's mistress, Mrs. Wilson. At her party, the narrator meets Gatsby, who explains he is the son of wealthy people from the Midwest and attended Oxford. Gatsby invites the narrator to lunch and shows him his medals from his service in the war. The narrator invites Tom to meet Gatsby. Gatsby wants the narrator to invite Daisy over for tea. When she arrives, Gatsby also shows up unexpectedly. A reporter arrives at Gatsby's door asking for a statement about the hundreds of people who have accepted his hospitality. Later that summer, the same group of people gather at Gatsby's house. Gatsby wants Daisy to tell Tom she never loved him and wants to go back to Louisville to get married as they had planned 5 years ago. Tom says he has investigated Gatsby's affairs and that he will continue to do so. Daisy admits she loved Gatsby too. Later that day, Mrs. Wilson is killed by a car that does not stop. Gatsby says he tried to stop Daisy from driving, but she couldn't, so he pulled on the emergency brake. George Wilson says he knows his wife was killed by the man in the yellow car. His movements are traced by the police, but he disappears for 3 hours. After 2 years, Nick remembers the rest of that day as a continuous drill of police and photographers at Gatsby's house. After Gatsby's death, Nick decides to return home to the east. On the last night, Nick looks at Gatsby's house one last time. Mr. Bingley, a wealthy man, leases Netherfield Park and is well liked by everyone. Jane is attracted to him, and Elizabeth thinks he might feel the same way about her. Darcy begins to notice Elizabeth's intelligence and starts to pay attention to her. Mr. Collins, a clergyman, arrives to court one of the Bennet girls. He decides to choose Elizabeth, and after a conversation with Mrs. Bennet, he changes his mind to Jane. Darcy suddenly asks Elizabeth for her hand in marriage, and she accepts without thinking. Darcy and Elizabeth talk, and he says he hopes to see Bingley and Elizabeth together often. Mrs. Bennet is convinced that Jane will be the one to marry Bingley. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, but she rejects him, saying she is not the right woman for him. Charlotte and Collins get engaged, and the entire family is happy with the match. However, Elizabeth feels that the match is unsuitable. Lady Catherine invites the group to dine at Rosings, and they are impressed by the grandeur of the house. Darcy unexpectedly declares his love for Elizabeth, and she explains that she has many reasons to dislike him. He explains that he had supported Mr. Wickham financially throughout his life, and that his sister, Georgiana, had been persuaded to elope with Mr. Wickham by Mrs. Young. Elizabeth reads Darcy's letter and realizes she had been wrong about him. She feels compassion for his feelings. The regiment is to be removed in a fortnight, and Elizabeth hopes that will put an end to her troubles with Wickham. Elizabeth is impressed by the size and beauty of Pemberley. She unexpectedly meets Darcy, and both blush deeply. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner express their admiration for Darcy, saying he is very different from what they expected. Elizabeth receives a letter from Jane informing her that Lydia ran off with Wickham. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner promise to help find Lydia and prevent her marriage to Wickham. Mr. Bennet eventually returns, appearing to be in good spirits. He admits that it was his own fault that Lydia ran away. Mr. Gardiner informs Mr. Bennet that he has found Lydia and Wickham, and that Wickham's circumstances are not as hopeless as they are believed to be. Darcy pays off Wickham's debts and provides Lydia with a generous settlement. Lady Catherine unexpectedly arrives at Longbourn and declares that Elizabeth's actions will bring disgrace upon her family, and that she will not be allowed to marry Darcy. Elizabeth resolves to give up on Darcy if Lady Catherine convinces him to break off his engagement to her. Elizabeth opens up to Jane about her engagement to Darcy, and Jane is happy. The Longbourn family hears that the Collinses have come to Lucas Lodge, as Lady Catherine had become angry upon reading Darcy's letter. Elizabeth convinces Darcy to reconcile with his aunt. Mascull and Nightspore are invited by Cragg to join him on a journey to Torments. Mascull wakes up on a red sand beach and meets Joawind, who explains that Mascull's blood is too thick for their world and that he needs an infusion of hers to recover. Mascull meets Oceax, a woman who possesses 3 eyes. She asks Mascull to get rid of her husband, Crimtiffin. Mascull agrees to go with her to warn him, but refuses to have anything to do with a woman who wants to use him. Mascull kills Crimtiffin after he threatens to turn Satcher into a tree permanently. Tiedemann, Crimtiffin's other wife, admits to killing Oceax. Mascull is tasked with carrying Crimtiffin's corpse to bury it. Suddenly, a loud crashing sound is heard, and Tiedemann tells Mascull she wishes to take his body as she is tired of being a woman. Mascull kills Digrung after he learns that Mascull murdered Crimtiffin. Mascull awakens in a brightly lit room surrounded by unfamiliar people. He sees his double and a brutish man breaks his bones. Mascull and Tiedemann encounter Spadevil, who explains he has come to Sant to take the old wisdom from Morga. Catus challenges Mascull to choose the superior faith by having one of his probes cut off. Mascull kills Spadevil and Tiedemann. Mascull meets Polecrab, a fisherman, and his wife, Gleamiel. Gleamiel offers to take Mascull to Swalenese Island, where the music will answer all his questions. Lehathvi asks Mascull to accompany her on a journey to find Thriel. She warns that Faceny may be too strong for him to endure. Lehathvi dies in Thriel, unable to exist in that world. Corpang joins Mascull on his journey to Lichstorm. Haunter explains that he has 2 male stones that repel the female particles of the earth. Mascull experiences a vision of joy and feels as if he has been visited by an angel. Sullenbode, a woman from Lichstorm, says she only wants Mascull for herself. As they continue their journey toward Adage, Sullenbode suddenly dies. Mascull buries her body and washes himself in a nearby hot spring. Cragg suddenly appears and tells Mascull that he will die that morning. Mascull's death arrives, and he sees Cragg beating on a blood-red spot with a hammer. Nightspore climbs the stairs toward the top of a tower and realizes he is surrounded by Crystalman's world. He understands that Muspel is fighting for its life against sin and baseness masquerading as eternal beauty and nature. A stranger is rescued from a drifting sledge by Mary Shelley. He reveals he too has been driven mad by his desire for knowledge. The stranger was born to a wealthy Genevese family. His parents took in Elizabeth, a beautiful orphan girl who became his sister. When he was 17, the stranger began studying the science of physiology and eventually created a human being. He becomes detached from the outside world and puts off all feelings of affection until his work is complete. Justine is accused of murdering William. The stranger believes the creature he created is responsible, but decides to keep this a secret. Justine is found guilty and executed. The stranger becomes overwhelmed with guilt and remorse. The fiend, the creature he created, tells the stranger he will leave mankind alone if he complies with his conditions. The stranger attacks the fiend, but eventually listens to his tale. The fiend learns more about the family he has been observing and becomes enraged when they attack him. He resolves to travel to Geneva to seek out his creator, whom he holds a deep hatred for. The narrator agrees to create a female companion for the fiend in order to save his family from further harm. Victor is charged with the murder of his friend, Henry Clerval. He is eventually released from prison, but feels his life is poisoned forever. Victor becomes obsessed with finding the monster that killed Elizabeth and pursues him across the globe. He eventually agrees to kill the monster. The creature, who had killed Frankenstein, explains that he feels immense guilt for his crimes and vows to travel to the most northern extremity of the globe and burn himself to ashes.